The woman everyone ignored would soon make a choice that no one else was willing to make, and that choice would change an entire family forever. Naomi Carter had worked at the Romano estate for nearly 3 years, yet most people could not have told you much about her. She was not the loudest employee, nor the most ambitious. She did not seek attention, and she certainly did not expect recognition. Every morning before sunrise, she quietly moved through the enormous mansion, preparing rooms, arranging flowers, polishing surfaces, and making sure everything looked perfect long before the Romano family woke up. The estate itself sat on a sprawling property outside New York City, surrounded by iron gates, manicured gardens, and towering trees that seemed to protect the secrets hidden within its walls. Expensive cars came and went. Influential guests visited regularly. Important conversations took place behind closed doors. Yet Naomi remained almost invisible inside that world. Most people saw only a maid carrying trays or folding linens. They never stopped long enough to notice the person behind the uniform. At 29 years old, Naomi had learned not to expect much from people. Life had taught her that lesson early. She focused on her work, treated everyone with kindness, and carried herself with quiet dignity. If someone overlooked her, she smiled and continued working. If someone forgot her name, she never corrected them. It was simply easier that way. Yet there was one person in the estate who always remembered her name. One person who never treated her like background furniture. That person was Margaret Romano, the mother of Damien Romano. Margaret was 74 years old and possessed the kind of warmth that made people feel seen. Unlike many wealthy people, she noticed small things. She remembered birthdays. She asked questions and listened to the answers. She thanked employees personally. Most importantly, she never measured a person's worth by their position. One rainy afternoon, Naomi was arranging books in the estate library when Margaret entered carrying a cup of tea. The older woman smiled immediately. "There you are," she said. "I was hoping to find you." Naomi looked surprised. "Me?" Margaret laughed softly. "Of course you. Who else would I be looking for?" Naomi could not help smiling. Moments later, they sat near the library window overlooking the gardens. Rain tapped gently against the glass while the mansion remained unusually quiet. They spoke about books, favorite childhood memories, and the changing seasons. It was not an extraordinary conversation, yet Naomi found herself enjoying every minute. Around Margaret, she never felt invisible. She felt like a human being. Across the estate, people often referred to Damien Romano as a powerful man. Newspapers described him as influential. Business magazines called him ruthless. Yet Margaret simply called him her son. Damien spent most of his time traveling, managing businesses, attending meetings, and solving problems that affected hundreds of people. As a result, he was rarely home. Naomi had seen him only a handful of times. Their interactions were brief and professional. To him, she was simply one of many employees working inside the estate. To her, he was a distant figure who existed somewhere between reality and legend. That evening, Margaret and Naomi walked slowly through the main hallway lined with family portraits. Golden light from antique chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors. For a moment, Margaret paused in front of a photograph taken years earlier. It showed Damien standing beside her during a charity event. The older woman smiled at the image. "He worries too much," she said. Naomi glanced at the photograph. "He seems very protective of you." Margaret's eyes softened. "He is. Sometimes more than he realizes." Naomi nodded. She could hear affection in every word. Neither woman knew that within a few days, the estate would host its largest charity gala of the year. Influential guests would arrive from across the country. Cameras would flash. Speeches would be given. Lives would change. And before that night was over, Naomi Carter, the maid nobody noticed, would face a moment that would reveal exactly who she truly was. As preparations for the annual charity gala accelerated, the Romano estate transformed into a world of constant motion. Delivery trucks arrived throughout the day. Florists carried towering arrangements through marble hallways. Event planners reviewed seating charts while chefs tested menus in kitchens large enough to serve hundreds of guests. Everywhere Naomi looked, people seemed focused on creating a flawless evening. Yet amid all the activity, Margaret Romano remained surprisingly calm. While others worried about schedules and appearances, she spent her mornings strolling through the gardens and her afternoons reading in the library. More often than not, Naomi accompanied her. The arrangement had never been official. It simply happened naturally. Margaret enjoyed the company, and Naomi appreciated the kindness. One afternoon, they sat together on a stone terrace overlooking a fountain surrounded by autumn flowers. A gentle breeze carried the scent of roses through the air. Margaret held a photo album on her lap and slowly turned the pages. Naomi noticed that most of the photographs featured family gatherings, holiday celebrations, and charity events from years past. "You have a beautiful family," Naomi said softly. Margaret smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Families are beautiful and complicated at the same time." Naomi laughed quietly. "That sounds true." Margaret turned another page and stopped at a photograph of Damien as a young man standing beside her at a community fundraiser. "He was 22 in this picture," she said. "He thought he could solve every problem in the world." Naomi studied the image. Damien looked younger, but the determination in his eyes was unmistakable. "And now?" she asked. Margaret smiled warmly. "Now he tries to solve even more problems." The conversation drifted naturally from photographs to memories. For nearly an hour, they talked about life, loss, hope, and second chances. Naomi found herself sharing stories she rarely told anyone. Margaret listened carefully, never interrupting. It was a gift she possessed. She made people feel as though their experiences mattered. Later that evening, while helping prepare decorations inside the ballroom, Naomi overheard several guests discussing the upcoming gala. The event would raise millions of dollars for children's hospitals and family support programs. Business leaders, politicians, and media personalities were expected to attend. The pressure to make everything perfect seemed enormous. Yet Naomi noticed something interesting. Whenever Margaret entered a room, people relaxed. Employees smiled. Guests became friendlier. The older woman carried a quiet influence that had nothing to do with wealth or status. She simply treated people well. 2 days before the gala, Damien finally returned to the estate. His arrival immediately changed the atmosphere. Security personnel became more alert. Staff members moved with greater urgency. Meetings filled the schedule. Naomi caught only a brief glimpse of him as he crossed the main foyer surrounded by advisors and assistants. He appeared focused, serious, and exhausted. Their eyes met for only a second before he continued toward a conference room. It was such a small moment that Naomi quickly forgot about it. Margaret did not. That evening she smiled knowingly as she sipped tea beside the fireplace. "He works too much," she said. Naomi laughed softly. "You have mentioned that before." "Because it is true." Margaret set down her cup. "Sometimes I worry he forgets there is more to life than responsibility." Naomi looked into the dancing flames. "Maybe he just wants to take care of everyone." Margaret's expression softened. "Perhaps." For a moment, neither woman spoke. Outside, evening settled across the estate. Inside, final preparations continued for the gala that would soon bring hundreds of people together under one roof. Neither Naomi nor Margaret realized that the approaching celebration would test the strength of their bond in a way neither of them could have imagined. The night of the charity gala arrived beneath a sky filled with stars. From the moment the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, the Romano estate came alive with light, music, and anticipation. Luxury vehicles lined the winding driveway. Valets moved quickly beneath glowing lanterns. Guests dressed in elegant evening attire stepped onto red carpets while cameras flashed and reporters documented every arrival. The event had become one of the most respected charity fundraisers in the state, attracting influential figures from business, politics, entertainment, and philanthropy. Inside the mansion, every room sparkled. Crystal chandeliers illuminated marble floors. Fresh floral arrangements filled the air with subtle fragrance. A live orchestra played softly near the ballroom entrance, creating an atmosphere of sophistication and warmth. Naomi spent most of the evening helping coordinate guest services. Dressed in a formal staff uniform, she moved carefully through crowded hallways, making sure everything operated smoothly. Although hundreds of people filled the estate, she still found herself paying special attention to Margaret. The older woman seemed radiant that evening. Her silver hair reflected the ballroom lights beautifully, and her smile never seemed to fade. Everywhere she went, people stopped to greet her. Some remembered past acts of kindness she had shown them. Others simply admired her warmth. Watching from a distance, Naomi understood why so many people respected her. Margaret possessed something rare. She made every person feel important. Near the center of the ballroom, Damien stood speaking with donors and community leaders. He carried himself with the confidence expected from someone in his position. Yet Naomi noticed something different whenever his mother entered the conversation. His expression softened. For a few brief moments, the demanding businessman disappeared, replaced by a devoted son. As the evening continued, speeches began. Charity organizers shared stories about families who would benefit from the funds being raised. Guests listened attentively. Applause filled the room several times throughout the presentations. The atmosphere felt hopeful and inspiring. By 10 o'clock, the event had already exceeded fundraising expectations. People celebrated the success. Laughter echoed through the ballroom. Glasses were raised. Music returned. For most attendees, it seemed destined to become another memorable evening. Yet, sometimes life changes in the space between two ordinary moments. Shortly before 11, Naomi stepped outside onto a side terrace to retrieve an item requested by one of the coordinators. The cool autumn air provided a brief escape from the crowded ballroom. Beyond the estate grounds, darkness stretched across the surrounding property. Everything appeared peaceful. When she returned inside, she noticed Margaret standing near one of the main exits speaking with several guests. The older woman looked happy, relaxed, safe. Naomi smiled and continued walking. Then something unusual caught her attention. Near the far end of the corridor, a sudden disturbance interrupted the flow of the evening. It lasted only seconds. Most people barely noticed. A dropped object, raised voices, confusion spreading through a small group of guests. Security personnel immediately turned toward the commotion. Conversations began to slow. Smiles faded. The atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly. Naomi looked toward Margaret. The older woman remained unaware, still engaged in conversation. Across the ballroom, Damien noticed the same disturbance and immediately started moving through the crowd. His expression changed instantly. Years of responsibility had taught him to recognize trouble before others did. Guests exchanged uncertain glances. Staff members paused. Somewhere beneath the music and celebration, tension quietly entered the room. No one yet understood the significance of what was unfolding. No one knew that within moments, a decision would be required. A decision that would reveal the true measure of a person's heart. And as Naomi looked toward Margaret Romano standing only a short distance away, an uneasy feeling settled deep inside her chest. The uneasy feeling growing inside Naomi intensified with every passing second. The disturbance near the far end of the ballroom had not disappeared. Instead, it seemed to be spreading quietly through the crowd. Guests who had been smiling moments earlier were now turning their heads toward the entrance. Security personnel exchanged urgent looks. Conversations faded into uncertain whispers. Across the room, Damien moved quickly but calmly through clusters of attendees, trying to determine what had happened. Margaret remained near the exit, still speaking, with several guests who appeared unaware of the tension building around them. Naomi instinctively took a step in her direction. Then another. Something inside her refused to let her stand still. The orchestra had stopped playing. That silence alone felt wrong. Hundreds of people filled the ballroom, yet suddenly the room seemed strangely quiet. Naomi glanced toward the main entrance and noticed security officers guiding several guests away from a particular area. Nobody was running. Nobody was shouting. Yet the expressions on their faces revealed concern. Serious concern. The atmosphere of celebration was disappearing. In its place came uncertainty. Margaret finally noticed the change. She turned slowly and looked around the ballroom. Her smile faded slightly. Naomi could see confusion in her eyes. The older woman was searching for Damien. Across the room, Damien spotted his mother and immediately started moving toward her. Unfortunately, dozens of guests stood between them. Every second seemed to stretch longer than normal. Naomi felt her heartbeat quicken. She could not explain why. She simply knew that something was wrong. Nearby, several event coordinators began directing guests towards safer sections of the ballroom. People followed instructions, but anxiety was beginning to spread. Some attendees checked their phones. Others gathered family members close. The mood had completely changed. Margaret took a cautious step forward as if preparing to walk toward her son. At that exact moment, confusion erupted near the entrance. It was not chaos. It was not panic. It was simply one of those rare moments when nobody seemed certain what to do first. Some people moved one direction. Others moved another. Security personnel attempted to create order. Naomi saw Margaret hesitate. The older woman suddenly looked very small standing in the middle of the enormous ballroom. For the first time all evening, she looked vulnerable. Damien called out to her from across the room. Margaret turned toward his voice. Naomi watched the scene unfold as though time had slowed. Guests shifted. Security officers reacted. Damien pushed forward. Yet there remained a gap between mother and son. A gap filled with uncertainty. Naomi never stopped to think. She never weighed consequences. She never asked herself whether someone else would act. The decision happened before conscious thought arrived. Every memory of Margaret's kindness flashed through her mind. Every conversation in the library. Every walk through the gardens. Every moment she had been treated not as a servant, but as a person. Naomi moved. Fast. Determined. Without hesitation. She reached Margaret's side just as the situation intensified. Wrapping an arm protectively around the older woman, she guided her away from the center of the confusion and towards safety. The effort came entirely from instinct, from loyalty, from love. Around them, security personnel finally gained control and began directing everyone toward secure areas. Damien reached them moments later. The relief on his face lasted only an instant before concern replaced it. Naomi's strength seemed to disappear as quickly as it had appeared. The room blurred around her. Voices echoed in the distance. Margaret held her hand tightly. Damien dropped to one knee beside her. For the first time since Naomi had entered his life, the powerful man looked completely shaken. And as worried faces gathered around them beneath the ballroom lights, nobody yet understood the full price Naomi had just paid for a choice made entirely from the heart. The ballroom remained suspended in a strange silence long after security personnel restored order. Guests stood motionless, uncertain whether the evening had ended or whether they were witnessing the beginning of something far more important. Damien never took his eyes off Naomi. The powerful man who normally commanded boardrooms and negotiated multi-million-dollar agreements seemed completely unaware of anyone else around him. His attention remained fixed on the woman lying nearby as medical professionals carefully examined her. Margaret refused to leave Naomi's side. She held her hand tightly, whispering words of encouragement while tears gathered in her eyes. Naomi attempted a small smile, but exhaustion quickly overcame her. Within minutes, she was transported to a nearby hospital for further evaluation. Damien accompanied her without hesitation. Reporters outside the estate immediately noticed the unusual sight. The Romano family was famous for influence and prestige, yet now the head of that family was abandoning his own event to follow an employee. Questions spread quickly, but Damien ignored them all. During the drive, he remained silent. Images from the ballroom replayed repeatedly in his mind. Every detail felt impossible to forget. The fear in his mother's eyes. The confusion in the crowd. Most of all, Naomi moving forward when everyone else froze. Hours later, the hospital corridors were quiet except for the occasional footsteps of nurses and doctors. Margaret sat beside Naomi's room while Damien stood near a window overlooking the city lights. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Margaret broke the silence. "She saved me." Damien slowly nodded. The words were simple, yet they carried enormous weight. Margaret looked toward the closed hospital door. She did not stop to think about herself. Damien lowered his gaze. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar. Guilt. Not because he had done something wrong, but because he realized how little he truly knew about the woman who had risked everything for someone she did not have to protect. Naomi had worked in his home for years. He knew her name. He knew her position. Yet beyond that, he knew almost nothing. The realization troubled him. Near midnight, a physician finally emerged with an update. The news brought visible relief to both Damien and Margaret. Naomi would need time to recover from the physical and emotional strain of the evening, but she was expected to make a full recovery. Margaret quietly thanked every member of the medical staff she encountered. Damien simply closed his eyes for a brief moment and released a breath he felt he had been holding for hours. Later, after his mother returned home to rest, Damien remained behind. The hospital floor had grown nearly silent. Soft light illuminated the corridor outside Naomi's room. Through a small window in the door, he could see her sleeping peacefully. For a long time, He stood there alone. Not as a businessman. Not as a feared leader. Simply as a son trying to understand the magnitude of what had happened. Eventually, he entered the room and sat in a chair beside her bed. Machines hummed softly in the background. Naomi remained asleep, unaware of his presence. Damien studied her face and found himself remembering something his mother often said. Character reveals itself when nobody is watching. Looking at Naomi now, he finally understood exactly what Margaret meant. And before the first light of morning touched the city skyline, Damien Romano made a silent promise to himself. The woman who had protected his mother would never be forgotten. Morning sunlight slowly filled the hospital room as Naomi opened her eyes. For several seconds, she did not remember where she was. The white ceiling, the quiet hum of medical equipment, and the soft light streaming through the window felt unfamiliar. Then the memories returned. The gala, the confusion, Margaret, the crowded ballroom. Naomi immediately tried to sit up before realizing how exhausted she felt. A gentle voice interrupted her thoughts. I would not do that just yet. Naomi turned toward the corner of the room and froze. Damien Romano was sitting beside the window holding a cup of untouched coffee. His suit jacket rested across a nearby chair, and faint signs of fatigue showed beneath his eyes. It looked as though he had spent the entire night there. Naomi stared at him in disbelief. Mr. Romano? Damien stood and approached the bed. Good morning. She looked around the room again, unsure whether she was dreaming. You stayed here? A faint smile appeared on his face. Someone had to make sure you were all right. Naomi lowered her eyes. The answer made her uncomfortable. She was accustomed to caring for others, not being cared for herself. Before she could respond, another familiar voice entered the room. Margaret Romano walked through the doorway carrying a small bouquet of flowers. The moment she saw Naomi awake, tears immediately filled her eyes. Oh, thank goodness. She hurried to the bedside and gently embraced her. Naomi felt emotion rise unexpectedly in her chest. Margaret held her hand tightly. You frightened me. Naomi smiled weakly. I am sorry. Margaret shook her head. Do not apologize for being brave. The room fell quiet. Damien watched the exchange carefully. For the first time, he began noticing details he had overlooked for years. The way his mother looked at Naomi. The affection. The trust. The gratitude. It was not the relationship between an employer and an employee. It resembled family. Later that afternoon, while Margaret met briefly with doctors, Damien remained alone with Naomi. The silence between them felt different now. Less formal. More honest. Damien looked out the window before finally speaking. My mother talks about you often. Naomi looked surprised. She does. Almost every week. He smiled softly. Usually about books, gardens, tea, things I never paid enough attention to. Naomi laughed quietly. The sound eased some of the tension in the room. Damien became thoughtful. Why did you do it? Naomi already knew what he meant. She looked down at her hands. Because it was your mother. Damien waited. Naomi hesitated before continuing. And because she has been kind to me from the first day I arrived. Her voice softened. Not everyone notices people like me. Damien felt those words more deeply than she realized. For years he had managed companies, negotiated deals, and solved problems. Yet somehow he had failed to notice one of the most important people living under his own roof. As evening approached, Margaret returned carrying a small box she had found among Naomi's personal belongings. While helping organize it, a folded letter slipped onto the blanket. Naomi's expression changed instantly. She reached for it, but Margaret had already noticed the faded handwriting. Is this from your mother? Naomi nodded slowly. The room grew quiet. Neither Damien nor Margaret knew it yet, but the letter resting on the bed beside Naomi contained a truth that would explain everything about the choice she had made on the night that changed all of their lives. The letter remained in Naomi's hands for several long seconds before she finally unfolded it. The paper had softened with age. Creases crossed the page from years of being opened and reread. Margaret sat quietly beside the bed while Damien remained near the window, unsure whether he should stay or leave. Naomi looked at the familiar handwriting and smiled sadly. My mother wrote this a few months before she passed away. The room immediately grew still. Naomi took a slow breath and began reading aloud. The words were simple. There were no grand speeches or dramatic declarations. Instead, the letter contained advice. Her mother spoke about kindness, dignity, and the importance of protecting people who felt alone. One sentence stood out above all the others. If you ever meet someone who makes you feel loved when I am gone, do not take that gift for granted. Naomi lowered the letter. Tears glistened in her eyes. Margaret gently squeezed her hand. Your mother sounds wonderful. Naomi nodded. She was. For a moment, she stared at the paper resting on the blanket. After she died, I spent years feeling like I had lost my place in the world. Her voice softened. Then I came to work at the estate. Damien listened carefully. Naomi rarely spoke about herself, yet now the story seemed to pour out naturally. The first week I worked there, I accidentally spilled tea in front of several guests. Everyone laughed. A faint smile appeared on her face. Everyone except Margaret. Margaret laughed quietly through her tears. I remember that day. Naomi nodded. You helped me clean it up. Then you sat with me for 30 minutes so I would stop feeling embarrassed. Damien looked toward his mother. He had no memory of the incident. Margaret simply shrugged. It seemed like the right thing to do. Naomi smiled. To me, it felt like much more than that. Silence settled over the room. The afternoon sunlight had shifted, filling the hospital room with a warm golden glow. Naomi carefully folded the letter and placed it beside her. Over time, Margaret became the closest thing I had to family. The words hung in the air. Damien suddenly understood something he had been missing. Naomi had not acted out of obligation at the gala. She had not acted because Margaret was wealthy or influential. She had acted because she loved her. The realization struck him with unexpected force. Later that evening, after Naomi had fallen asleep, Damien and Margaret sat together in the hospital cafeteria. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Damien broke the silence. I spent years thinking I understood loyalty. Margaret looked at him curiously. Damien stared into his coffee. Then a woman everyone overlooked taught me what it actually looks like. Margaret smiled softly. Some of the strongest people are the ones nobody notices. Damien thought about the letter. About the years Naomi had quietly spent helping his mother. About the choice she made without hesitation when it mattered most. For the first time, he realized gratitude alone would never be enough. What Naomi had done deserved to be remembered. It deserved to be honored. As evening settled over the city skyline beyond the hospital windows, Damien Romano made another decision. This one would not remain private. Soon, everyone who attended the gala would learn the truth about Naomi Carter. And when that day came, no one would ever look at her the same way again. 2 weeks later, Naomi returned to the Romano estate. The autumn leaves had begun covering the long driveway, and the mansion looked exactly as she remembered it. Yet everything felt different. Employees greeted her warmly. Security personnel smiled when she entered through the front gate. Even people who had rarely spoken to her before now stopped to ask how she was feeling. Naomi appreciated their kindness, but she remained slightly uncomfortable with the attention. She preferred quiet corners, library conversations, and simple routines. Fame, even temporary fame, felt unfamiliar. What she did not know was that Damien had spent those 2 weeks preparing something very carefully. Invitations had been sent across the city. Guests from the charity gala had been contacted. Business leaders, community organizers, reporters, and family friends were all asked to attend a special evening gathering at the Romano estate. The purpose remained secret. Curiosity spread quickly. Many assumed Damien planned to announce a major charitable initiative. Others believed he was preparing a business announcement. Nobody guessed the truth. On the evening of the event, the grand ballroom once again filled with elegant guests beneath sparkling chandeliers. The room looked remarkably similar to the night everything had changed, yet the atmosphere felt completely different. Instead of celebration, there was anticipation. People whispered quietly while waiting for Damien to appear. Naomi had been invited as well, though she had no idea why. Margaret personally convinced her to attend. Trust me, the older woman said with a mysterious smile. You will want to be there. Naomi arrived wearing a simple navy blue dress. She immediately felt out of place among the wealthy guests and influential figures. Several people recognized her and offered kind greetings. Others looked at her with admiration. The attention made her nervous. She stayed close to Margaret throughout the evening. Then the ballroom lights dimmed slightly. Conversations faded. Damien Romano stepped onto the stage positioned near the center of the room. Instantly, silence filled the hall. Damien looked across the audience before speaking. His voice was calm, but carried unusual emotion. A few weeks ago, Many of us gathered in this room for a charity gala. Heads nodded throughout the audience. Most of you remember the event because of the confusion that interrupted the evening. The room grew quieter. Damien continued. I remember it for a different reason. He paused briefly. I remember it because one person made a choice that changed my life. Naomi felt her stomach tighten. Slowly, Damien turned toward her. Hundreds of eyes followed his gaze. The ballroom became completely silent. Naomi immediately wished she could disappear. Damien stepped away from the podium and walked toward her. Every guest watched. Every camera turned. Margaret squeezed Naomi's hand gently. Damien stopped only a few feet away. His expression was sincere, respectful, grateful. For years, he said, speaking loudly enough for the entire room to hear, I believed strength came from power, influence, and control. He looked directly at Naomi. Then I met someone who taught me that true strength comes from selflessness. Emotions swept through the audience. Several people already appeared moved. Damien slowly turned back toward the crowd. Tonight is not about business. It is not about money. It is not about me. He extended a hand toward Naomi. Tonight is about honoring the woman who reminded all of us what courage looks like. And as Naomi stood frozen beneath the ballroom lights while hundreds of people watched, she realized something extraordinary was about to happen. For several seconds, Naomi could not move. The grand ballroom seemed to disappear around her as she stared at Damien standing before her with his hand extended. Hundreds of guests watched in complete silence. Business leaders, reporters, community figures, and members of high society all waited for what would happen next. Naomi slowly stood from her chair. Her heart pounded. She had spent most of her life trying not to draw attention to herself. Now the attention of an entire room rested upon her. Damien guided her toward the stage. The moment she stepped beside him, the audience rose to its feet. Applause filled the ballroom. The sound echoed from the marble walls and crystal chandeliers. Naomi's eyes widened in disbelief. Some guests wiped away tears. Others smiled warmly. The ovation continued far longer than she expected. When the room finally grew quiet again, Damien returned to the podium. His voice carried emotion that few people had ever heard from him. Many people know Naomi Carter as a maid who worked at the Romano estate. He paused and looked toward her. I know her as the person who reminded me what courage, loyalty, and love truly look like. The room remained silent. Every word mattered. Damien then spoke about the woman Naomi really was. He described her kindness toward employees, her friendship with Margaret, the countless small acts of generosity nobody had noticed because she never asked for recognition. He shared how she spent years helping others quietly while expecting nothing in return. Then he spoke about the night of the gala, not as a story of danger, not as a story of fear, but as a story of character. When uncertainty filled the room, Damien said, one person moved towards someone who needed help. Everyone else had a reason to hesitate. Naomi did not. Margaret stood and slowly joined them on stage. Tears shimmered in her eyes as she embraced Naomi. The audience immediately grew emotional. Many had never witnessed such genuine affection between people from such different worlds. Yet at that moment, no differences seemed to matter. Margaret held Naomi's face gently and smiled. You gave me something precious, she said softly. You reminded me that family is not always the people we are born to. Sometimes family is the people who choose to stand beside us. Naomi could no longer hold back her tears. The ballroom became completely silent once more. Then Damien revealed the final surprise. In honor of Naomi's courage and compassion, the Romano Foundation would establish a new community program dedicated to supporting young people who had lost parents and lacked family support. The initiative would carry her mother's name, ensuring that the values passed through a simple handwritten letter would continue helping others for years to come. Audible emotions spread through the crowd. Naomi covered her mouth in shock. She had never imagined such a thing. Damien smiled gently. Your mother taught you to protect people who felt alone, he said. Now her legacy will help thousands more. The audience rose again, this time applauding even louder than before. Reporters lowered their cameras. Guests wiped away tears. Employees who had worked beside Naomi for years stood proudly. In that moment, she was no longer the quiet maid people overlooked while walking through the halls of a mansion. She was a woman whose character had changed lives. As applause filled the ballroom and Margaret held one of her hands while Damien held the other, Naomi looked across the room and saw nothing but respect. The room went silent. And that day, the world remembered what dignity looks like.